Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Demmin. I'm a clinical psychologist and I've worked as a psychologist for 34 years, largely as a therapist. And in my free time, I'm an author and a writer, written books on self-esteem and on the nature of thinking. And then after kind of trying to struggle with the thought process itself and outline that in one of my works, I've since 2015 been focused on a long-standing interest in Buddhism and Eastern religious philosophical theory and meditation. But for myself, I haven't meditated in the traditional way and tried to kind of find my own path based on readings of Buddhist masters and other authors interested in Buddhism in particular. So yeah, what we're going to talk about today is non-dual awareness, which is a fascinating subject for me and many other people, and it's very complex in many respects in terms of how to describe. So today we're going to be talking about how to attain non-dual awareness. And this is an exciting subject for me because I've, through my own efforts and endeavors, I have experienced non-dual awareness, and for varying lengths of time and intermittently. So I haven't perfected the attainment by any means, but I want to say that it's a wonderful experience to have, and we're not trying to attain it in and of its for reasons of just experiencing it for that goal in and of itself. We're reaching for somewhat loftier goals, or much loftier goals, in the context of enlightenment. So I myself don't necessarily aspire to becoming an enlightened human being per se, but because it's, again, difficult to get there, and that we can define enlightenment as, in essence, the cessation of suffering, and so the end of suffering. So how does one attain the end of suffering ultimately? In a world, in a material, substantial world that is just, is relentless. It never stops coming at us, and we're all, in our own ways, having to survive in this real material world that can be super challenging, in so many obvious ways. So how does one end suffering in that context? How is that possible? Well, it's possible through means essentially of an attitude, of a psychological and emotional attitude based on knowledge and many other skill sets that one brings to bear as a way to end suffering in that way. So there's essentially three goals and three paths that help us potentially end the cessation of suffering. And one of them has to do with being non-attached to outcomes. So one way to end suffering psychologically is to develop the mindset, the ability to not become attached to outcomes. So think about that. In the context of our normal lives, all of us as human beings, all of us really are attached to outcomes. So, and that's most reflected in our thinking. So in our thoughts, all of us, to varying degrees, are thinking about future outcomes and either worrying and being afraid that they're going to happen, or longing for them to happen, desiring that they happen in the way that we imagine or hope. So consistently caught up in that kind of thinking, and then certainly thoughts about the past as well. Harboring past regrets is a reflection of being overly attached to outcomes. Harboring a lot of prior sadness about the way things turned out, also represents an attachment to outcomes. So just think about how dominated we are by that one tendency of being attached to outcomes, and how that affects us emotionally and psychologically in every minute of our days, and for the most part in probably unpleasant and somewhat destructive ways. So that is a very lofty goal all by itself, the attachment to outcomes. So the other major quality, the other path to enlightenment that represents a different goal other than the attachment to outcomes is the cessation of thinking. So think about that as well. what a lofty goal that is. How hard would that be for any of us to achieve? It's really unfathomable to even begin to realize how attached we are to this habit of thinking. We in essence, and there's a lot of developmental agreement psychologically about what happens to each of us over the course of our lives, is that we become thinking creatures. Our self-identities are primarily seated in our thoughts and in our reflecting on our thoughts, which embody our beliefs and opinions about things. So that's even another aspect of thinking that's powerful, because that becomes part of my kind of objectively seen self-identity. Oh, that's what I believe. Oh, that's my opinion about this, that, and the other thing. And that becomes a part of my sense of self. But there's a more immediate sense of self that's happening as I'm thinking. My consciousness or awareness is completely captured by the acts of thinking, by the silent sentences going through your mind, so to speak, one after the other, some of which are reflecting on the one that's just passing. So we're caught up in this habit of thinking we experience as a literal manifestation, an expression of the essence of who we are as a thinking self. So as one path to enlightenment and one goal, we're attempting to learn how not to think. Man, just given the habit of it and how much significance each one of us is giving to those thoughts as embodying the essence of who we are. The idea of not associating and experiencing the essence of who we are through our thoughts is hard to fathom in and of itself, let alone allowing oneself to give up the possibility of thinking, what feels like giving up the possibility of thinking. But it isn't that. It's developing a skill, an ability not to think when you so choose, freeing yourself from the tool of thinking that you become. So that's another major goal or path to enlightenment, another way of kind of gleaning enlightenment. So the third is what we're going to be talking about today, and that is about non-dual awareness. Wow, just not easy to grapple with in terms of even defining it. But interestingly, we can experientially relate to some of what I'm about to say about certain aspects or qualities of consciousness. So as a quick aside, historically, Buddhists over thousands of years frown on, in a way, even trying to define consciousness, because to them it is undefinable, unqualifiable, because they see it as that through which all realities manifest, all experiences. So it's that through which everything else arises. Consciousness is that through which all manifestation arises, all experience. So to try to qualify that to consciousness itself, it's beyond all the things that are expressed through it or that arise through it and into it. So it's something unqualifiable to them. But out of respect for that mindset, I mentioned that historically, but it can still be conceptualized in some ways that are helpful in helping us think about it. So the first, I think subjectively, the most important thing first to identify about consciousness is that it represents or reflects an inherent sense of knowing. Somehow there appears to be an intelligence of a kind that consciousness represents that allows one the experience of knowing. So that is powerful. The very experience of knowing about any object, of what it is, what it means to us, the idea that consciousness knows things and knows it even in a sense has an awareness of, self-reflective. It has a self-knowing, awareness aspect to it as well. But it's still all about knowing, a sense of knowing. And then coupled with that is that it inherently represents or reflects a sense of presence. So consciousness in and of itself seems to embody the experience or sense of presence, of existence. So couple that with that sense of knowing. So consciousness embodies a sense of an experience. It's tough to use these words, of presence, of existence, and of knowing, all together, all of that just together. So because of its nature, is that through which all other experiences and manifestations arise. It is also talked about as being grounded in immediacy, that consciousness is a sense of immediacy. So we have the experience of time, of a past, present, and a future. And consciousness is that through which the experience of time is expressed or manifested in our awareness. Because as human beings and through our own thoughts, we have the ability to represent the idea of a past, of a present, and a future, and to represent those ideas even in imaginary forms, in the forms of images, of past memories, of future projections. So we create within consciousness a sense of extension, of time, of temporality. But in and of itself, consciousness is grounded in immediacy, and is that through which the sense of time is engendered for us, for example, as human beings. So it's not of time. It doesn't exist in time over an extended way. So it's not temporal. It's atemporal. It's not of time. It's said to be eternal in that sense. Eternal meaning not of time. So that's one aspect of consciousness. Isn't that amazing to think about, that in your current present state of knowing, of presence, of existence, there's an immediacy to it that just is. So along with that, consciousness is also seen or viewed as non-spatial, as not having any dimensional qualities whatsoever in terms of spatial aspects. But this seems to defy our own experience and intuition, because through consciousness, we create an experience of space through our perception of vision and audition. We create an experience of space, but it's a perceptual one that we're creating. And so we feel like there's an inherent spatial reality to consciousness, but there isn't. Consciousness is said to be, when in its the actual experience of it, the inherent reality of consciousness, empty of perceptions, that it has a spaceless quality. There is no dimensional aspect again. So one Buddhist master described that aspect as consciousness is a circle whose center is everywhere, but circumference is nowhere. So without a circumference, there's no spatial, we cannot represent a spatial reality anymore. Center is everywhere, however you want to conceive that. A center, just a sameness of spacelessness everywhere. So that's amazing to think of too, that for you right now, the essence of your consciousness, absent perception, if we could remove all perception. Buddhists and Eastern religious philosophical thinkers say that without perception, consciousness is inherently empty. There's an inherent emptiness to it, which goes along with, again, an inherent eternal, atemporal quality, an inherent spatial, non-spatial quality, along with the sense of emptiness that we just mentioned, the sense of knowing, the sense of presence and existence. That's consciousness, okay? Wow. So, and still more than that even. More than that in terms of how Eastern religious thinkers view consciousness as the essence of God. That it's the essence of Brahman, of spirit, of pure spirit. So we can go that way too, and it's amazing to read those writings and to try to grasp what's hidden in the depths of our consciousness. for most of this that are obscured by these other realities. So now that we've defined consciousness, we want to define non-dual. Well, that's okay. So that's non-dual. No, so excuse me. So in having defined consciousness, we now have a clear understanding of what non-dual awareness is. But in order to really clarify, so non-dual awareness is consistent with everything we were just saying about consciousness, but we can further clarify non-dual awareness by first really specifying what dual awareness or dual consciousness is. Whew, boy, this is just, I think, a mind-boggling reality for me. To really, really grasp the significance of what I'm about to say is just amazing. So it's exciting to me, and I hope that I can clarify it in a way that's helpful. So dual awareness, dual consciousness really is reflective of or representing in its words a sense of separateness, the experience for human beings of feeling separate from the surroundings. So what that separateness for all of us, I think, is experienced very much the same and for the same reasons. You may never have articulated it before, but for most of us, we are assuming implicitly, with even not even ever having thought about it, that our consciousnesses are in our heads and behind our eyes. So again, no one ever taught me that. No one had to tell me, hey, your consciousness is back here. For all of us, somehow we just developed that belief automatically without any thought about it. So our consciousness, the sense of separateness, my consciousness exists here in my head and behind the eyes. And what I'm assuming there as well is that the surroundings, the material world, the world that actually exists out there in a material molecular form, possesses in and of itself inherently to itself visual and auditory qualities, for example. So the idea is that you believe that the world exists inherently in visual and auditory forms, and that my consciousness is back here behind my eyes, separate from it, completely separate. And though I can connect with it, you can connect with it, the experience of it is as separate from this consciousness located back here. So it's as if we're in a cave, looking out, into the world in visual and auditory forms. And we're just accurately picking up on it through our perceptual apparatus. Somehow we're just accurately picking up on those visual and auditory realities that just seem to be inherently exist out there. So there it is. That's dual awareness, a sense of being separate from a material world that exists in visual auditory forms, and that our consciousness is separate from it. The mind-boggling reality is that it's just even crazy to admit, and Buddhists use the word delusion purposely, and it's the right word. Delusion meaning a false belief. We are all living a false belief that consciousness is located in the head behind the eyes, separate from an already given visual and auditory world that just exists seemingly as it exists. So the idea is that that's wrong. That's just wrong. It's just not true. Consciousness isn't, number one, first of all, located behind the eyes and inside the head. It almost seems silly to talk about it in a way, because there's no empty space in here behind my eyes. There's no physical space behind here in my brain or otherwise where there's a consciousness residing, right? Like, isn't it almost funny to think about that we've automatically assumed that somehow the consciousness, in the way that we just defined it, think about our definition today, has planted itself inside of our heads or brains or wherever, and it's looking out through the eyes at the rest of the world at large. It's separate from it in visual auditory forms, right? It's almost funny, but in a way, it's not funny as well, because there's there are negative consequences even to that belief and that way of experiencing oneself relative to the rest of the world. And it really, the negative consequences are primarily seen as obstacles to higher levels of awareness and experience. And that's why we're talking about it today. So we've defined now dual consciousness or dual awareness. And now again, what we're thinking about in terms of non-dual awareness takes on a completely different kind of understanding. We, in the context of non-dual awareness, what we're realizing is that all we ever know of the material world is a perceptual field or projection that we create wherever we are. And it's just so mind-blowing to think of the truth of this, that wherever you are projecting for words that don't even really have any inherent meaning in themselves as well. It's like projecting in our experience, our mental experience, whatever that is. It's so hard to actually even define. We're projecting a visual display wherever we are, and an auditory display too. It's wherever we are. And then of course there's taste and smell and touch that are all perceptions, and that we're, as biological creatures, creating this, for lack of a better word, like an interface between you as a biological creature and the surroundings, the material surroundings. You're creating, engendering, projecting a mental experience that is representing the material world. It's a representation. It's an interface. It's like a virtual reality, almost literally, that you're creating. And so the reality is that the material world doesn't exist inherently as it is in visual and auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, gustatory forms. So we're creating that as biological creatures, which is just crazy to think about, that you're engendering perception wherever you go. So you can imagine then that, so for every human being, for pretty much on Earth, wherever each human being goes, they're projecting a perceptual field that consists of a vision, an audition, etc., that doesn't actually exist in the surroundings, which is hard to fathom, again. So there's we all know and believe, even though some people, there's different theories even about this, but that there's a material molecular world out there, an Earth, and a sun, and other suns, stars, and planets, and solar systems, galaxies. We all know this is this amazing thing about this material universe, but we never ever will know it as it is unto itself. And Buddhists even talk about what it is inherently unto itself, and it's just it's a constant regression just to smaller, and we're just having to then conceptualize whatever form smaller is taking, and it's just this kind of ad infinitum that of the material world in terms of whatever it is unto itself. It's impossible to describe without a perspective, a vantage point that we're creating relative to it. So it's all very profound and complicated, but to begin to think about yourself in this way, in this new way, as not existing as a separate consciousness behind the eyes relative to the so-called inherently visual and auditory surroundings. It's a huge leap, and it's a necessary one that we'll be talking about more. So the next thing that we need to talk about is a concept of this whole idea that I was just sharing called the perceptual sphere. So that's also in my book, The Practice on Perceptual Forms, which is basically, in essence, the material of which I'm going to be sharing with you today. So the perceptual sphere is just a name for what I was just describing, is that for each of us, wherever we go, we seem to create, I say a sphere because there's almost a spherical quality that's created by the roundness of your eyes and its sockets. And we have this in front of us, almost like a spherical quality to visual experience in particular. So the idea is that each one of us engenders, projects, creates experientially a perceptual reality. Gosh, it's just crazy to think about. And so it's helpful to engage in what's called a thought experiment relative to thinking about the perceptual sphere. And it helps us, again, get in touch with other aspects of what we're talking about in terms of the differences between dual consciousness and non-dual consciousness. The idea is that a thought experiment is something that we can perform in our imaginations that we wouldn't be able to perform in reality. And Albert Einstein, for example, was famous for utilizing thought experiments. One of his most renowned one was imagining an elevator falling in free space with an individual inside of it. And from imagining that, he was able to derive further mathematical laws and whatnot about the nature of the universe. So we're not comparing ourselves to Einstein in this moment by utilizing thought experiments, but it's still interesting to think about the idea that you're the only biological creature on Earth. Possible, that's our thought experiment, and you're standing at a beach, for example. So you're at the beach, the only biological creature on Earth, and what's happening for you on the beach is that your presence as a biological creature is projecting a perceptual display of vision, of sound, of probably taste, feeling certainly of the wind on your body, smell, salt, etc. And so isn't that unbelievable that as a presence, as a biological creature, you're not just there as a biological creature juxtaposed to the molecular material surroundings of the beach. For you subjectively, on an inaccessible experiential and mental realm, are experiencing, and again, this mental way, this perceptual world for you that doesn't exist in the surroundings. It does not exist. There is no vision in the surroundings. There is no sound in the surroundings. So the idea is, and this is why it's a whole chapter in all introductory psychology books, is about perception. What creates perception? And we need to do a little quick lesson in it. So with regard to vision, on the most simplistic level, what we know is that photons, particles of light, are entering our eyes, and they're being transformed, transduced into biochemical impulses traveling along neurons through various regions of our brain, and that are then being interpreted and reformed into the experience, the projection of vision. The brain is creating the experience of vision that does not exist in the surroundings. So same with sound. Sound consists of vibrations in the air. No sound in and of itself with these vibrations in the air that are occurring at different frequencies and intensities, that our ears take these physical vibrations entering them, and again, through a series of biochemical changes, essentially the biochemistry, the biochemical process represents in some way the physical aspect of those waves, and those waves are transduced, transformed into biochemical impulses, again projected to the temporal lobes, in this case of our brain, and as a result of that phenomena create the experience of sound that does not exist in the surroundings. You do not realize that, in a sense, you are like a superhero in that regard. Think about our concept of superheroes. They possess these amazing powers. The power that you possess, that you have not ever even acknowledged or recognized, is that you have the power to create vision. So I imagine, some cat comes up to me and he says, "Hey man, I heard you have this really special power. What is it?" I said, "Man, I can create this experience called vision." So the idea of that, right? And that guy would go, what is, if you could explain him to what that is, that guy would go, wow, that's fantastic. What an ability. I mean, think about just what a tremendous experience in reality vision can be. Vision is amazing. It's just incredible. And the same thing with sound. You could say as the superhero that I have the ability to create sound. Wow, okay. I mean, really, I know it sounds corny, but I mean it literally. We just haven't thought about it in these ways to really grasp the significance of what it means to be a human being in this case. And that wherever you go, you create this perceptual experience for yourself, along with everything else that goes with our natures in this time and place, that we just don't grasp this. I mean, I want to say we're godlike, small g, godlike in that we can create these experiences. Some people even believe that God, in a sense, lives through us, through our consciousness and through the perceptions and whatnot that we experience in the world, that God lives through us and in a sense gets to go through the journeys with us, which could be a variety of good and bad. So that's where we're at, is realizing how significant it is there to be on the beach generating this element of perception, this incredible display of perception. So the other thing I wanted to say is, too, to bring home the significance of what this means about that each one of us is a perceptual sphere, is that we're not only like superheroes, we're not only kind of godlike, but we're not only superheroes and we're not only godlike, but we're like shapeshifters. So when I stumbled across this concept of shapeshifter and was thinking about it maybe 6 months ago, really struck me as a very strong metaphor. So in science fiction circles, some of you may know this concept or idea of shapeshifters, some being that can take the shape of any other physical, material, molecular object. So he or she could transform their shape into something in the physical material world. Well, analogously, which I think this is amazing to think about, is that each one of us is a shapeshifter, in that we shape and create, we create and shape perception. So wherever you go, whatever surroundings you're in, you're creating for yourself an experience of this mental, ineffable experience of the surroundings that doesn't exist in the surroundings. So you're literally a walking perceptual sphere that's shifting its shape in every moment as you move in any small way. Your experience, this perceptual sphere is shifting. You're the perceptual sphere. You're a shapeshifter of perception. It's just a whole new way to begin to think about yourself. And that's in part the whole point, is to begin to think yourself in a wider way, in a more embracing way, in a more inclusive way, in a way that is also more accurate. That's in large part why we're even talking about this. It's about moving up that ladder towards enlightenment. So we're on the beach and we're a perceptual sphere. And the next part of the thought experiment is to ask oneself, okay, what if now you just disappeared? Okay? What if you just disappeared? Excuse me. What's left? Again, we're thinking about these distinctions between the perceptual reality you engender and the actual material world. What is left? And I alluded to that a little bit earlier, in terms of it's pretty much undefinable in terms of whatever it is in and of itself. And it's without your perspective and without you generating an experience of the material surroundings in a spatial visual form, and in a temporal form as also having a past, present, and future. Without you bringing those qualities and characteristics to that outside material world, if you disappear as the only biological creature on Earth, the material world around you possesses no such aspects in and of itself. It's, again, there's no more even vantage point through which to even conceive of and perceptually experience this slice of the surroundings in front of you. With you gone, suddenly reality vanishes in terms of any point of view. Suddenly we vanish into all of it and none of it. It's very difficult to grasp exactly what the material world consists of without you engendering a sense of spatial reality, of temporal reality, a sense of presence relative to it. It's hard to conceive of what reality is, and our thought experiment helps us get in touch with that. In talking about the perceptual sphere and in focusing on the significance of perception so much, because if you think about it again, it's just so amazing. The material world is amazing, right? And that's because of our dual awareness, our sense of separateness from a material world that inherently exists in visual perceptual forms. A lot of us are very conscious of how incredible it is to think about the universe, what we know. There's a universe out there that's profoundly vast, unfathomably vast, and it's material and molecular. It exists in a substantial, real way. And it's amazing that we live on an Earth in this time and place with these just beautiful, beautiful, sights and sounds and smells. It's just incredible that we many of us are aware of how wonderful it is to this Earth. It's so beautiful and wonderful and amazing, and it's great to grasp the importance of the Earth and our surroundings in that way. But as we've seen, we're engendering the beauty ourselves. You're creating the visions that you're experiencing as existing in the surroundings. You're creating them right now. You're creating sounds. You're creating it. You're creating the wonder. There's a collaboration going on here, a co-occurring reality going on here between the material world impacting your biological presence and you then generating this perceptual sphere, relative to it. You're creating the beauty with your presence and what your mind, your brain is capable of. You're creating it. You're engendering it. It doesn't exist out there, remember? Wow. So now, how amazing to think about the fact that you're the walking beauty perceptually of the world. You're the walking beauty of all of it. So that doesn't mean to relegate the material world to a lesser place or lesser importance, but it's still just trying to see things truthfully and accurately, and in a way too, when you really start to grasp it, is wonderful in and of itself. It's wonderful to realize what we're talking about is the essence of who you are, is also to look at the nature of perception itself. And we touched on this just subtly a little bit ago. But boy, again, most of us have never even thought about this. We can just ask, what is vision? What is it? If it's a perception, by definition, it's not molecular. It's not made of matter. Matter's coming at it, to begin with, and it's again transformed via a biochemical chain reaction into a display. But we don't know what vision is in and of itself. It's immaterial. So we can't capture its essence either. Try talking to a blind person who's been blind from birth about what vision is. How do you describe what it is? If you really think about it, how could you actually ever convey the essence of it? Experientially, just impossible. But it doesn't have any inherent nature or reality that we can really define other than this as this ethereal, ephemeral, experiential reality that seems so vivid and real as if it exists out there, but it's not. It's this it's something mental that we can't really grasp in terms of its inherent essence. Same with sound as well. What is sound? It's ungraspable in terms of the experiential reality of it. So that's something to think further about perhaps, because it may be hard to grasp really what I'm saying about perception, but one way that Buddhists typically think about perception, and I think this is helpful, is they see perceptions as reflections of material objects on the surface of the water. So that's very helpful, I think. Perceptions, they're not real. The idea as in being reflections in the water then here being consciousness, that those perceptions aren't real, that they somehow are compatible with the water in a sense, because that's where they kind of adhere, so to speak, or occur. There's an inherent compatibility there. But what are perceptions? They're more like reflections of something, right? The material world, a projection, a reflection, a made-up virtual reflection of the real world. That's what perceptions are. So what have we accomplished now? Where are we right now? Now it's really amazing. We have, each one of us, the sense of consciousness, of knowing, a sense of knowing things, of presence, of existence, and that has, it's grounded in immediacy. It has no inherent spatial reality. It's inherently empty. But through consciousness, perceptions exist. Vision, sound, taste, touch, smell. Perceptions are co-occurring with consciousness. So we have a sense of knowing and presence that we bring to perceptual reality, a sense of consciousness plus perceptions co-occurring in and as, so to speak, the perceptual sphere. Both realities, consciousness and perceptions, are immaterial, and meaning non-molecular. So they're compatible with each other as these immaterial realities of some so-called mental nature, which is a realm of existence. It's literally a dimension of reality. Each one of us with our perceptual sphere, a dimension of reality, mental, that's entirely separate from the nature of the reality of the material world, of the molecular world. Entirely separate dimensions, molecular versus consciousness and perception, which again co-occur together and create this perceptual sphere for each one of us. So I find all that mind-blowing and potentially life-changing, even in terms of how you think of your self-identity and how you're going to define yourself relative to the surroundings. Profoundly significant stuff. All by itself, without even going any further. Just to even begin to kind of think about this reality or fact as you walk around with yourself, these intellectual truisms that we're referring to. The next most important topic to bring into this discussion is how do we define ourselves and our sense of presence? And the answer is perceptually, which would make perfect sense, right? Because everything about your consciousness is embodied by different perceptual forms. Nothing else. Consciousness and perception. That's it. That's all you ever know is consciousness and perception. You never know the real world, material, molecular world as it is to itself. So we come back to how do we identify ourselves if it's perceptual? What's the meaning of that? As we develop over time, we first become, around the age of 2, physical body cells. I get a kinesthetic sense of being a separate physiological entity that feels different when I do this than when I touch the furniture in front of me. That feels different. So I begin to, as I grow older, identify myself and experience myself more and more as a body self, as a physical herb, separate from a physical surroundings. That's a perceptual. There's again, when you touch your body or anything touches you, that experience is engendered by pressure points on receptors on your body that again are transforming or transducing that pressure into neurochemical impulses up to the brain that again create the experience of touch. So that's our first way that we experience ourselves relative as separate from the environment, as a physical, kinesthetic herb, separate body self. And that's where my consciousness seats itself or experiences itself. It's through the body. That's why children have such different experiences of the world than adults do, because their body cells pretty much alone, and that's it. And it creates a different experience of oneself relative to the world. The next way that we experience ourselves perceptually and developmentally, especially through the ages around 4 to 7, or no, earlier, excuse me, I'd say 2 to 5, where you begin to more and more experience ourselves as emotional selves as well. So emotions are bodily realities as well. We experience them kinesthetically. They have other meaning relative to the reasons why we're emotional, but the emotions themselves are bodily based kinesthetic experiences, and it feels as if, because they're happening now, they're manifesting in various forms right now, and I begin also to identify myself as an emotional self. I'm a body self, and now I become an increasingly emotional self. I'm angry herb right now. I'm sad herb right now, and I experience myself through my bodily presence and emotional presence. But emotions are perceptual too. Developmentally, from especially, the ages of 7 onward, we become increasingly thinking selves, where we internalize sentences in visual and auditory forms that we usually engage in early on in the writing visual form or the auditory form of sentences that we learn to internalize and silence in our own heads and experience as our thoughts. Internally spoken sentences, silently spoken sentences to ourselves are our thoughts. And consciousness increasingly through those ages begins to kind of seat itself in its experience while thinking, and of all the beliefs and opinions embodied therein. That's how I'm experiencing myself in the moment as this thought-based self. But thoughts are quasi-perceptual in that they have an auditory and a visual basis originally, and then engaging them in this mental form, this again, and kind of ineffable mental form. By engaging in them, our consciousness becomes increasingly centered in there, seated in unfolding thoughts. And they're grounded in immediacy, and our consciousness is living through the beliefs and opinions manifesting therein. So we become thought-based selves, with those thoughts being quasi-perceptual. So the point I'm trying to get across is even your sense of self, as for me, as Herb, for you, as whomever, you experience your sense of self-presence and identity through the experience of your body, your perceptual body, your emotional perceptions, and your quasi-perceptual thoughts. Your sense of self literally is being experienced through perceptions. And that's so important to identify as true, because when we bring in the reality that wherever you are, you're projecting an entire perceptual sphere consisting, again, of visions and auditions, that you're far more than just those 3 sets of perceptions I just discussed. You are just as much, in terms of your self-identity, in a very accurate and literally true way, the projection of vision that you're engendering and creating right now, that you're manifesting now, and audition, that is just as much of an expression of who you are as those 3 aspects of perception we just defined. You can widen, you can embrace more of a perceptual reality and incorporate it into your intellectual and experiential self of who you are. So for me, for example, when I'm experiencing non-dual awareness, if I were standing here now experiencing non-dual awareness, my experience of self-presence and identity would be being experienced through the perception of the entire room. I am the perception of the room. I am the room as perceived, literally, in all of its perceptual aspects. That is a better definition and a more accurate definition of who you are experientially in the moment. You are the entire surroundings as perceived. And intellectually, you can grasp that as a truth. And it's absolutely paramount to grasp that reality. So think about what we've come to now in our understanding. When we come backwards and we think about non-dual awareness and we think about enlightenment, we now have a totally different way of thinking about why it's attainable. So this part relates to something that would just drive me crazy when I was a kid, when I was about 16 and became interested in Buddhism and Eastern religious philosophical thought. When I would ask what enlightenment was, and even non-dual awareness, people said, well, it's the oneness with everything. It's a oneness with everything. And that was the best I got. And it's not that there's not many wonderful writings out there that explain all this much better than those answers that I was exposed to as a kid. But that drove me crazy. Oh, how is it possible that I can be one with the material world? That made no sense to me, but based on what I had heard and read, I believed that there was something very profoundly important and incredible in all those writings, something to be better understood and maybe attained. So I continued on this path and trying to understand more and more over time through my life. And all this began to come together really in the last 5 years, where now it all makes sense. Intellectually, I understand. Now I see how one could achieve non-dual awareness, because it's not about becoming the material world. The material world never exists to us in and of itself as it is to itself. We'll never know it as it is to itself. We only know it by creating this virtual reality that represents it, that's inherently compatible and co-occurring with my consciousness. These immaterial mental so-called realities that are compatible. And now, because the perceptual sphere is just perceptions, and now there's a consciousness co-occurring with it that inherently exists as a sense of knowing and presence relative to a self-presence and a knowing of the perceptual world at hand, and that it also embodies an eternal and infinite and empty quality, and that those aspects of consciousness are co-occurring with this field of perception, this sphere of perception. Now we see how it's possible to become enlightened in the context of specifically that path of non-dual awareness. So once that occurs to you, that makes sense, that makes total sense now. I get it. I get how this non-dual awareness might be achieved. It makes sense. At least I hope that's the case for you, because it really made sense to me. And I said, oh, it was such an aha moment. Just incredible. So we can talk about now the first path to non-dual awareness that I have talked about and developed in my book, The Practice on Perceptual Forms, is represented by the idea of the intellectual understanding that I just conveyed to you about the true nature of who you are, juxtaposed again what you used to believe about being this consciousness behind the eyes, just accurately picking up on an already inherently given visual and auditory world, and to understand what it really is. So that intellectual understanding that's being conceived through words and the meaning embodied therein is literally, as a first path, a bridge to non-dual awareness, the actual experience of it. You, in what I'm about to ask you to begin to try to do, you need to take with you, in my instructions, so to speak, this intellectual understanding and knowing that the essence of your self-identity and presence is being expressed and manifested as the entire perceptual sphere, not just those three emotional qualities that we defined earlier. You have to believe that the best, most accurate expression of your self-identity and your experience of presence is through the whole perceptual sphere. I'm laughing at myself with the big arm gestures. So that's the insight, that insight meditation people talk about. That's the insight, essentially, what I just conveyed. And that insight is seen through insight meditation practices as essential to the actual attainment of non-dual awareness. So that's the first path in my practice on perceptual forms, is the importance and significance of that intellectual understanding. The second path is to engage in practices that help you experience non-dual awareness. So that's the second path, is experiencing it. The just in and of itself, that's the goal. So the first path is the intellectual bridge or understanding that you take with you to certain practices that I'm going to outline in a minute, to presently occurring perceptions. In the second path or goal of actually experiencing non-dual awareness. Whew, boy, that's a lot to ask already, just to keep that in mind. So the first instruction in the practice of perceptual forms is to focus on the literal presence of the perceptual forms where you are. It seems like a very strange instruction, but I think it can make sense if we talk about it more. But that's the first instruction, is to focus your attention on the fact of the presence of the perceptual forms. Let's start with visual. And just to focus on their presence and the fact of their existence. That's absolutely a necessary instruction, I believe, and practice in which to engage in order to achieve non-dual awareness, at least at first, is to focus on the literal sheer presence of them, while keeping in mind that their presence is a manifestation of your self-identity, of your presence as a consciousness is taking the form of these perceptions as the entirety of it. So you're keeping in mind that understanding as you're focused on the sheer existence and presence of the visual, we'll say for now, perceptual forms in front of you. That's an absolutely necessary two-path approach, in my opinion. How to get there, how there's ideas in the book and instructions in the book as how to realize the actual experience of non-dual awareness. And there's a couple more thought experiments that we can touch on that can help create that or engender that experience. The first for me, which I later found out was first conceptualized by a man named Harding, and who wrote a couple books on all by themselves on the idea I'm about to convey. But for myself, I also had the same idea on my own without even knowing about him. But the idea is a thought experiment, and in this case, the thought experiment is to imagine having no head, that just all of a sudden head's gone. However, the perceptual experience at hand remains entirely the same. That's the thought experiment. It's not that hard to imagine. No head, but everything just stays the same. But how does your experience as you consider that a thought experiment change? I know for me, when I imagine having no head, suddenly that division, that experiential division between a consciousness behind the eyes and the so-called material surroundings, like instantly disappears. And with the idea of no head, but perceptual experience remaining exactly the same, now there seems to be just this oneness of experience being defined as consciousness plus perception. That's our experience. And so all of a sudden, when I imagine having no head, it's just a oneness of experience. And when I first started to engage in that thought experiments, I had glimpses of one dual awareness. That's it. That's non-dual awareness in an instant. And that's all it took, because once it happened, I was like, oh, Jesus, that's it. right? That was it. You experientially recognize it as such, as a oneness of experience. There's no separation between a consciousness behind the eyes and a so-called material world, because we're also bringing that understanding to bear as that happens, that this is just perception, not just, but this is perception co-occurring with consciousness, awareness, and what that means in terms of their immaterial, mental, and unique reality, dimension of reality. That you get a glimpse of that, and now we're off to the races. So another thought experiment that's helpful for me and has been very helpful is it's kind of a contrast experience that I came across a few years ago. And this one may be for me even more powerful. And in this thought experience, I imagine that all of a sudden the material world just completely disappears. All molecular reality just completely disappears. But my perceptual experience just remains the same. So the idea of that, when I imagined the physical world disappearing, but perceptual experience remaining the same, I had a similar experience to that of when I imagined having no head. And that experience was all of a sudden, the entirety of who I am is perceptual. Because if it's a physical world isn't responsible for it because it no longer exists, then my presence is responsible for it. My presence is it. So all of a sudden there's a oneness and a unity to being the entire perceptual sphere at hand. So that's yet another thought experiment that can give you glimpses into non-dual awareness. And when you're engaging in that initial instruction to focus on, you're focusing on the presence of the perceptual forms, their existence, while keeping in mind that they're expressions of your entire self-identity. What you're shooting for in essence is to experience your sense of presence as a consciousness through the presence of the visual and auditory forms around you. That is an actual experience where you experience your consciousness as existing through the perceptual forms at hand. And that you actually feel as if you are the perceptual forms. You feel as if you are the presence of the actual perceptual forms themselves. So as a quick aside, it's so interesting to think about this because for those of us in this dual consciousness, visual and auditory realities exist inherently in the surroundings. So I'm just picking up on them accurately. And in viewing my relationship to the material world in that way, what we believe is happening that's not, is that it's the stimulus of vision and or sound that comes first, and that we're reacting secondarily to its presence. That's how we're implicitly experiencing ourselves relative to the world because of this false belief about duality. So I'm just secondarily reacting to the presence of visual and auditory forms. That's not the truth. So what we're saying right now is that you are literally the presence of sound. That I, for example, Herb, am sound. My presence manifests and engenders itself experientially as sound. I am sound. I'm not reacting to sound. I'm projecting sound. I'm creating sound. And same thing, you can react to sound with certain conceptual, oh, that's great, that's beautiful, etc. But you are sound, literally. You are sights. You're not reacting to the sight of the truck. You are the sight of the truck. When you grasp that you're generating perceptions that are not real, that are not material, that they're immaterial, and that they're co-occurring with your consciousness as this unfathomable mental phenomena, you are sound. You literally are sound and sight. It's when you grasp the reality of it, it helps you become them as well. And in the book on the practice of perceptual forms, it gives some other techniques, other ways of helping you experience that non-dual awareness. And it does become easier. In fact, one of the things that I've realized experientially in that regard is that when all this comes together, and then I say in a given moment, okay, let's go for it. You know, Buddhists hate this kind of talk about attaining it because they say it's already there. But let's go for it, Herb. it's really only one mental step for me. It takes one mental step, but it's like riding a bike, but in that ability to ride the bike, all these other steps had to be incorporated. But once you get there, it's like pushing off the ground to get your bike going. You start riding. It literally is like standing on one side of a threshold and taking one step into the other. So one of the most profound things to think about that happens, and I've been aware of this experientially, is that consciousness seems to, again, be inside the head and outside the eyes. And as long as that's part of your experience, you can't experience non-dual awareness. So what I have found is that via that first instruction, when I focus on the sheer presence of the visual perceptual forms around me in particular, when I focus on their existence, their presence right now, that keep in mind all the other things that I mentioned that go with that practice, is that what you find is that your consciousness will come out from behind the eyes, and it will go to the presence of those forms and experience itself through their presence. And it will feel as if, for lack of a better word, as if consciousness is pasted on those perceptual forms, just pasted. It's just so one with them. They co-occur together. It's experiencing itself in its presence through their presence, which again is just an amazing experience, but not what we're shooting for in and of itself, just one path through two higher goals. So isn't that amazing that can happen? Gosh, it's just hard to even fathom. So the last thing I want to talk about is by using that instruction of focusing on the existence and presence of the perceptual forms at hand, that you'll eventually have the experience of consciousness seemingly coming out from behind the eyes and experience itself through the presence of the perceptual forms. And that's an incredibly necessary occurrence. Consciousness has to experiencing itself as coming out from behind the eyes and into and as the perceptual forms at hand. That's an absolutely necessary thing to happen. So stay with that, and I think through some of these other thought experiments that are discussed in the book, you may have some success in realizing instances of non-dual awareness that could develop even more from there. So I want to share as a motivational reality, as a way of, again, maintaining that focus and aspiring to these goals that I'm outlining. I want to just share again the amazing aspects, the amazing reality of perceptions that we've all taken for granted. And that, in a sense, given everything that I've shared, perceptions are like a lover that's being ignored, and a lover that is experienced as separate, as too far from, in this case, consciousness, too far for consciousness to ever attain, to ever reach. And when in truth, perceptions are part of consciousness, but it's hiding behind the eyes, as if in a cave. Like literally, as if in a cave, consciousness is separate from perception. It thinks it's perception, separate from perceptions, So to realize that's not the case is to try to embrace the motivation. My lover, let's take vision. She's my lover. I've been ignoring her. I want to go to her. I want to embrace her. She means everything to me. I've been taking it for granted, her presence, literal existence for granted, when she's part of me and I want to be with her. There's a Buddhist tanka that I think represents that, the male and female consort together. And in my opinion, their togetherness, consciousness and sensory matter combine, co-occur to project a perceptual display. So we're lovers. Gosh, perception and consciousness are lovers. They're together. Reach for her. Come out of the cave, in other words, and engage in the instructions that I'm suggesting. If you'd like to give it a try, engage in the instructions and go to your lover. Embrace her. So yes, all this. I hope it was all clear enough and inspiring. That would even be more wonderful if this talk were inspiring and helpful. So I appreciate your willingness to listen to what I had to say about all this. And again, best of luck if you try to engage in these practices, because again, they're wonderful and can lead to even more beautiful and wonderful things. So all the best to you. Thank you, everybody. Okay, bye-bye.